Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I am blessed to be joined by Philip Booth. Philip wears many hats, chief among which, at least for this interaction, he's Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics and Director of the Catholic Mission at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. And he's joining us to talk about the concept of globalization and free trade. Philip, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Pleasure. Very well, thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, it's always nice to reconnect with you.
Yeah.
I want to begin by asking you to talk about a concept of free trade. And then after that, if we can, also to just touch on how there's a real sense of a Christian virtue ethic in the concept of free trade.
Okay. Well, trade involves exchange between individuals. And from the point of view of an economist, there's no obvious reason why exchange between individuals at the local level should not expand outside the local level and then should not expand outside national boundaries, so that in the end, people should be able to trade with whomsoever they like anywhere in the world. And currently free trade is coming under attack. And I think there is a real problem there because free trade leads to mutual gains. In nearly all circumstances that you can envisage. If parties are trading, if economies are open to trade, both benefit from that. And free trade is under attack, and the narratives that are being used to attack free trade are essentially what the economists call zero-sum narratives, that, if they gain from trade, it can only be because we lose from trade, that there's a zero-sum rather than a positive sum. So immediately that creates a kind of tension in the international level. If people are campaigning against free trade, if they're opposing free trade, if they're supporting protectionism, then I think it does something quite damaging at the level of international relations and promotes narratives that other people, other economic actors, other countries are actually a problem for our country, rather than people and countries with which we should cooperate in order to get mutual gain and mutual economic flourishing.
This concept of trade as a zero-sum game, is it a belief in, especially laissez-faire economics, or at the very least, a concept of true free trade, or is that something that's really born out of a Marxist paradigm?
I'm not sure it's a Marxist paradigm necessarily, and I'm not sure what proportion of those people who make that argument really believe it. I mean, to some extent, I think people use it as a sort of form of political opportunism. They see a group that maybe feels as if their position has been undermined by free trade, and then they develop the argument in order to garner the support of that group for a particular political program. I don't necessarily think it's a Marxist argument. One would then have to be accusing the many in the Republican Party who are opposed to free trade of being Marxists, which would be stretching the vocabulary
right.
a little bit, I think. But it's certainly not born of any true analysis of either the facts or the theory. Now, it has to be said that the major gainers from globalization in the last 40 years have been poorer countries and middle-income countries who previously were very, very protectionist. The incremental gains that a country such as the United States, or for that matter the United Kingdom, get from increasing free trade, increasing trade relationships when those trade relationships were already very extensive, are quite small. So it is true that the major gainers from the modern era of globalization since the 1980s have by and large been the middle and lower income countries. But that doesn't mean to say that the higher income countries have not gained at all. They have.
Now, that raises a crucial question. When we think about globalization and therefore the global diversification of labor, and you're talking about gains and losses, what are there concerns about what these higher income nations are losing in that interest, and is that fueling some of the attacks on free trade?
Well, yes, I think some of the attacks on free trade are being fueled by the perception that in particular regions, especially of the US, I think this is much more of a US phenomenon than it is a European phenomenon. The particular regions in the US have lost out because of globalization, because of free trade, because of other countries essentially dominating markets that they used to dominate. But most of the empirical evidence suggests that the changes there, those countries, Rust Belt areas, as they're often known, that employment in the old industries hasn't reduced really because of globalization, but much more because of changes in technology. So it takes these days one person to make the amount of steel which would have been made by 8 people just 40 years ago. So in most advanced countries, you've tended to find manufacturing employment fall sometimes quite dramatically, especially in my country, especially in the UK, whilst manufacturing output has actually increased within those countries. So I think that there are other things going on, but it's always easier to develop a simplistic analysis which blames the foreigner, blames foreign companies and so on, rather than say, well, actually this is a phenomenon which we can't easily do anything about because it's to do with the development of technology, and we have to find better ways to promote new employment opportunities for those who lost their jobs.
This, to me, is a little reminiscent of what Pope Leo XIV is also talking about in Magna Humanitas.
Yeah.
It's not so much that he's afraid that jobs are going to be displaced. He knows that with each technological revolution, we've seen that happen. It's that we have to create avenues for further employment.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes there might be a role for government there, providing training opportunities and so on. But often it's about the government getting out of the way, and so that new businesses are not impeded from developing and using the new technologies to create more jobs by regulation, so that people are not impeded from moving from one area to another by, say, building zoning regulations which prevent the building of houses and the expansion of cities, and also welfare systems as well must be designed in such a way that they help people into work rather than keep people in a life of not working.
In fact, therein lies perhaps one of the biggest issues for a lot of high production, high income nations, that we've unfortunately federalized welfare systems so much that they've created a certain system of dependency that unfortunately limits productivity.
That's true, and I think also, and Pope Francis used to talk about this, maybe not in a direct way, but certainly in an indirect way, that we've sort of dehumanized and bureaucratized welfare systems. Now, if you go back to the 19th century, when with the development of friendly societies and mutual aid societies, both in the UK and the US, if misfortune hit a family due to death or industrial injury or unemployment, then the mutual aid society would provide some financial aid, but it would also actually provide support that was appropriate for that person, because they would know the person who had suffered misfortune. Whereas in modern day welfare systems, they run through a bureaucracy. They run through governments. In my country of 70 million people, yes, all they can do is present you with a check, essentially.
Right. I'm talking with Philip Booth. He is a professor of finance and economics at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. He's also the director of the Centre for Catholic Mission there. And he is talking with us about this concept of globalization and free trade from a virtuous Christian perspective. Now, Philip, very quickly, in about 30 seconds, how ought Catholics to think about trade rightly in terms of the faith? And we'll continue on the other side of the break.
Yeah, okay. I think it's a very difficult question to answer in 30 seconds. Catholics should have a positive disposition towards being involved in economic activity with people outside their own borders. That would be my starting point.
In fact, I think that's a beautiful starting point. Once again, Dr. Philip Booth, he is Professor of Economics and Finance at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. And we're talking about globalization, we're talking about free trade, and therefore the Catholic responsibility to engage virtuously and rightly in the entrepreneurial sphere and the trade sphere for the sake of building the common good, thinking of trade in light of the good that it does beyond the spheres of the smallest realms that we exist into, in this case, a global sense of community. We're going to take a break now, continue on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm joined by Dr. Philip Booth. He is Professor of Economics and Finance at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. And we're talking about globalization and free trade. Philip, just to pick up, I know that was a rather difficult thing, but you did it beautifully in the 30 seconds. I want to ask you, therefore, when we think about market forces, when we think about trade, especially in terms of free trade, there is a lot of expectation of Christian virtue at play here, natural virtue at play here, without which the system falls flat.
Yes. No, absolutely. And without, the word credit, for example, which is essential to all trade, both internal and external, comes from the word to trust, belief, etc. So, and without trust, whatever form of political environment you have, economic outcomes tend to be absolutely terrible. So even if you have, I think, a broadly free economy with limited government regulation is in general the best for economic outcomes. But actually, if you have that in a society with low levels of trust, you won't get good economic outcomes. And similarly, if you have a centrally planned economy with lots of government activity in economic life, with low levels of trust and high levels of corruption, again, you'll get terrible economic outcomes. And not just terrible economic outcomes, terrible social outcomes and as well. So, Christian virtues are essential for flourishing economic life. Trust, but entrepreneurs also need courage. Entrepreneurs take considerable risks. Even entrepreneurs who are wealthy because they've been successful in the past, they could just sit on their money, invest it in a diversified portfolio, go and sun themselves on a yacht for the rest of their lives. But they don't. They risk that capital in order to set up another business venture to try to improve their lives, of course, but also to employ people and sell goods and services and improve the life of others. So it's absolutely true that Christian values and virtues need to be at the bottom of well-ordered economic life.
In fact, that's an extremely crucial point that you raise, because thereby the risk, when managed rightly, produces reward, and that's the creation of wealth. But the creation of wealth is also the result of the creation of value for the human race. And so all in all, entrepreneurial activity done rightly is a good thing.
Sure, and Catholics would say that the entrepreneurs should be producing goods and services through the right means. So producing, if you're a publisher, producing books, journals and newspapers and not pornography, and by employing people and looking after your employees well rather than treating them badly or using buying products which are produced by people trapped in slave labour and so on. Yeah, so producing good goods and services by the right means is something which all Catholics involved in entrepreneurship, all Catholics involved in investment and choosing in which companies to invest should bear in mind.
Now, that therefore presents the virtue ethics structure for especially Catholics engaging in entrepreneurship. I want to expand the conversation into this reality of stewardship, that in engaging in the entrepreneurial sphere, we are stewarding even the gift of our faith, right?
Yeah, so if you go back to the story of creation, we were created we were at the pinnacle of the created order, and we were put on earth to work as co-workers with God in order to live flourishing and fulfilled lives, and that involves being a steward and treating the rest of creation in an appropriate way, but also making sure that we live fulfilled lives close to God and help others live fulfilled lives by promoting the common good in the economic sphere, if that's our calling.
Now, because of that, when we think rightly about the concept of free trade, like you've mentioned, anyone in theory should be free to trade with anyone at any time. You've got that whole principle of subsidiarity that we've got to grapple with, but that can be held in healthy tension here.
Yeah, I think there's an amazing quote actually, which I use in my lectures on globalization and in quite a few other contexts actually, by Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti. Now, Pope Francis, most people would think was quite sceptical of economic globalization. Maybe sceptical is the wrong word, but he certainly wasn't
cautious,
cautious. He wasn't an enthusiast for big business. Let's put it that way. But in this quote, he juxtaposes two positions which he argues are not the positions that Catholics should hold. The first one, I may have got these in the wrong order, but the first one is people who detach themselves from their local community and their local environment become, as was once said by a politician in the UK, citizens of nowhere or citizens of the world, and have no real feelings for their responsibilities towards their family, their local community, and so on. So he was critical of that. And then he was critical of people who were created, and he used the words, created a museum cut off from the rest of the world, only interested in parochial things, destined, I think he used the phrase, destined to do the same thing day after day. And he said, we must make sure we do both. Yeah. We, on the one hand, we keep rooted in our local community, and on the other hand, we must remain open. Of course, Francis was very interested in the question of migration, as is Pope Leo the 14th. And migration is an aspect of globalization, and that's one particular area where we need to sort of think of how we reach out to the stranger, reach out to those who are unfamiliar to us, and so on.
So I have to ask then, you think about Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and how they thought about localism, or distributism, however they called it. How would that square with how that thought process went about?
Well, I think Pope Francis is warning about both. You could say he's warning about what some people would call the Davos set today, of people who fly around the world talking about climate change, but he's also warning about people who think that all economic activity should be conducted on a local basis, which I think is problematic from an economic point of view, but it's also problematic culturally. But as ever in Catholic virtue ethics, vices and virtues are kind of complementary. So you probably find that people who are more trapped in that local environment, they probably have quite strong community bonds, stronger community bonds perhaps than I would ever manifest in my own life. And at the same time, those who are who partake in the process of globalization and don't have strong community links, they're probably very welcoming and so on to migrants and to people who are different from them, and get on very well with such people. So virtues and vices are always complementary, and Pope Francis does talk about holding these things in balance. I think it's a very good way of thinking about it.
Exactly,
and we should think about which of the two we identify with, and which of the two groups. And I think we should contemplate the part of the passage which is aimed at us.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. So which part am I heavier in, and what is the tension that's calling me to?
Mm-hmm.
Now, okay, so from there then, as we're trying to think about religion and liberty, religion and economics, religion and entrepreneurship, by virtue of our faith, we're not called to be isolationists, which means there is a real Christian stewardship in the entrepreneurial sphere, in the trade sphere, and in fact, one could argue it can only be done rightly when one is held ultimately to accountability before God in the entrepreneurial work.
Yes, there's no question at all that not only in terms of economic and social outcomes is it necessary for a Christian ethic to underlie what we might call capitalist or market behaviour. It's also important for our own life of faith, our own flourishing, our own ultimate fulfilment, that we can't detach our work lives or our lives as entrepreneurs from our lives of faith. You can't, you go to church on Sunday and then the rest of the week you just spend doing the day job, whether that be as an entrepreneur or anything else. So it's absolutely the case that if we want a society in which people genuinely flourish, people have to think about their calling within the economic sphere, which is part of the social sphere, which is part of our overall lives which we should dedicate to God.
I've been talking with Dr. Philip Booth. He is Professor of Finance and Economics at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. We've been talking about globalization, free trade, and also the question of markets and Christian stewardship. So, Philip, we've got about a minute left in the broadcast. I want to ask you to speak to all of our listeners and viewers right now to be willing to engage in that risk, engage in entrepreneurship, engage in trade, knowing that it is our faith that provides us the guiding light.
Yeah, okay. Let me just sort of end with one little factoid from economics. So in the last 40 years, we've seen the biggest and most meaningful reduction in global inequality that we've seen in the whole economic history of the planet. Now, people often talk about inequality, it's always growing and all the rest of it. They're not. The income distribution of the world as a whole has diminished markedly. And the reason for that is because there are many countries in the world, people often point to China, but there are many other countries where people have been freed, at least to some extent, to take part in the business economy, to be entrepreneurs, rather than be living in economies which are entirely controlled by the state. And we, as Christians, we have to be free to choose and follow the calling which God has for us. And as I mentioned, the economic sphere is an important part of the social sphere, and most of us do have some kind of calling in the economic sphere.
My guest has been Dr. Philip Booth of St. Mary's University, Twickenham, London, and we've been talking about free trade, Christian stewardship, and engaging in entrepreneurship in the market. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.